We're going to talk about the Kennedy assassination today. This is, of course, the most infamous of the Cold War murders. It's not the only one. So the Cold War is the context. Regardless of what you think about the crime itself, who did it and why, it all fits pretty nicely in the Cold War. If Oswald did it as a communist sympathizer, it's obviously a Cold War murder. If Oswald had nothing to do with it and Kennedy was killed because he was soft on communism, that too is a Cold War murder. This is a difficult topic to discuss because of the complexity and the controversy that continues. The professional historians tend to avoid this topic like the plague. I think it's because there's never been a consensus on what exactly happened to President Kennedy. There are still many open questions. But within the research community itself, there is slowly a consensus forming, and we'll talk about that in the conclusion. The significance of the Kennedy assassination it seems obvious. The traditional way that we change governments in this country is through elections every 4 years. We didn't do that in 1963. We changed governments with gunfire. We tend to think of this as being beneath us. This is something that happens in banana republics, as the old saying goes. But it happened in the United States in 1963. I think for our purposes as a survey class, perhaps the best way to get at this topic is to discuss the official investigations of the Kennedy assassination. So what I want to do is briefly characterize each of the investigations, the Warren Commission, the Garrison trial, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the Assassination Record Review Board. And I'm going to bring in one unofficial investigation to sort of round this out. So we'll start with the Warren Commission. President Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza, and you can refer to your photographs here of Dealey Plaza. You can get a good idea of distances and trajectories of bullets and things like that by looking at this photograph. And at 12:30, Kennedy's motorcade was fired upon. The number of shots is disputed, and that doesn't need to detain us here. Kennedy was rushed immediately to Parkland Hospital, just a few miles away, and he was declared dead there at 1 o'clock. President Johnson almost immediately appointed what he called a Blue Ribbon Commission to investigate this murder. The purpose of the Warren Commission was to not only to certify the FBI's report on Kennedy's death, but it was to preclude individual investigations in the state of Texas. So the Warren Commission, named after its chairman, or the Chief Justice of the United States, the Warren Commission, its findings are fairly simple. They said that Kennedy was killed by a lone gunman, an ex-Marine named Lee Oswald. The commission said that Oswald fired 3 shots at the presidential limousine from the Texas School Book Depository, which you can see on your picture here, is above and behind the president when he is shot. There are only 3 shots fired, according to the Warren Commission. There's no conspiracy. The Warren Commission tends to suck the meaning out of the president's murder. It's almost as if President Kennedy was struck by lightning as he moved through Dealey Plaza that day. Oswald himself is characterized as a loser, a communist sympathizer, a sympathizer of Fidel Castro. As an ex-Marine, he had actually moved to the Soviet Union and had lived in Russia for a couple of years. He had a Russian wife with whom he had 2 children. So the Warren Commission says essentially this is bad luck. The president had a bad day. He happened to run into a lone nut who wanted to go down in history. Now, the Warren Commission's case depended upon what has gone down in history as the magic bullet. This bullet, according to the commission, would have to inflict 7 wounds on the president and on Governor John Connally, governor of Texas, who is seated directly in front of the president. This bullet has to be able to perform this task because the commission concluded that there were only 3 shots fired. Now, one of those shots clearly blows the president's head off, and you can see this in the Zapruder film. I've included a link here to the Zapruder film, but you can Google it yourself and look at a number of different versions of it. So one bullet hits the president in the head. A second bullet misses the limousine entirely, strikes the bridge down by the underpass in front of the limousine. This bullet kicks up a piece of concrete, which then slices the cheek of a bystander. So we have 1 bullet to the president's head and 1 bullet that misses the car entirely. That leaves 1 remaining bullet. This bullet inflicts 7 wounds, 1 in Kennedy's back, according to the Warren Commission, or high up on his neck, 1 wound exiting the president's neck, and then 5 wounds on Governor Connally through his back, chest, wrist, and left leg. So if you can buy the magic bullet theory, and probably the best place to see this demonstrated, Oliver Stone's film JFK has a nice scene where Kevin Costner portrays Jim Garrison, and they demonstrate the magic bullet in this film. If you haven't seen this film, you should. And you can probably YouTube this particular section of the film. So the American people were, for the most part, satisfied with the Warren Commission's report. People did not tend to question their government in the early 60s the way it's become commonplace to do so now. I just want to say a couple of more words here about the Warren Commission's portrayal of Lee Oswald as a sort of historic loser, communist sympathizer, bad father, bad husband, an assassin. Oswald's story is a little more complicated than that. He tried to join the Marine Corps too early. They sent him home, said, come back when you're 18. He did. He joined the Marines. He was sent to a top-secret base in Japan where he helped monitor U-2 flights over communist countries in East Asia. He would later defect and travel to the Soviet Union and stay there for a couple of years. He met a woman there, Marina. She was the niece of a Soviet intelligence officer. Marina said that she met him at, I believe it was a communist trade union dance. That sounds like a lot of fun. She said she thought Lee was from one of the Baltic countries because of his accent. He spoke fluent Russian. Of course, Lee Oswald was from New Orleans. That's the accent she heard. It's very odd. How many of you know a 20-year-old ex-Marine who speaks fluent Russian? Is it any accident that Oswald is in Russia? At any rate, Lee and Marina are married. They have a couple of children, and they come back to the United States. The other problem with Oswald, not only his service record and his high clearance to monitor U-2 flights, but there is an appearance of multiple Oswalds in Dallas before the assassination. One at a downtown car dealership where a Lee Oswald went to test drive a new car, drove entirely too fast on the interstate, frightening the car dealer. When they get back to the dealership, this Lee Oswald makes an offer on the car, which is too low. He gets angry at this rejection and says that maybe he'll go back to Russia to buy a car. This is not terribly subtle. The implication, of course, is that he's coming into money very soon and he's going to go back to a communist country. Another Lee Oswald is found firing at other people's targets on a firing range, a shooting range. This causes a controversy. Another Lee Oswald is, we have evidence of trying to put a new sight on a rifle. Again, these are all incriminating incidences of a Lee Oswald doing things when the Oswald we know in history is at none of these places. He's at work or otherwise engaged. So this begins to take on the look of an intelligence operation, with Oswald as a U.S. intelligence agent, low level perhaps, but nonetheless, he's being moved around the board like a pawn. Now, like I said, the Warren Commission report was accepted for the most part. We didn't hear anything else about the Kennedy assassination until the late 60s, when the district attorney of New Orleans, Jim Garrison, brought charges against a local businessman named Clay Shaw. The Garrison trial, investigation and trial, became something of a media circus. The jury acquitted Clay Shaw, but afterwards the jury was polled and it was unanimous that Garrison had demonstrated that the president had been killed as a result of a conspiracy. The jury simply did not believe that Clay Shaw had anything to do with this conspiracy. So again, the Garrison case, because of the ridicule heaped upon it by the media and the circus-like atmosphere of the case, tended to discredit people who promoted further investigation into the Kennedy case. So the Kennedy case slipped back into history again. It wasn't until the mid-'70s that it reemerged. The result of Watergate was a series of investigative bodies by the Senate and the House looking into the goings-on regarding Cuba and the Central Intelligence Agency. You have to remember that the attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro were still top secret. When the American people found out about this, they were quite shocked. The Church Committee and the House Select Committee on Assassinations dug deeper into these issues, and it kind of opened a can of worms here. Once it became obvious that there was an attempt by the government through the CIA and the Mafia under the Kennedy brothers to kill Fidel Castro, then it began to look as if maybe the Kennedy assassination had not been fully investigated, and the House Select Committee was set up to answer any remaining questions. Now, the House Select Committee called a number of people to testify, subpoenaed them to testify, people like Sam Giancana and John Roselli, two high-level mobsters that had participated in the attempts to kill Castro. Both of these men were murdered before they could testify. Another gentleman, George de Morenscheit, he apparently had worked as Oswald's handler when Oswald was in Dallas. He too was subpoenaed to testify, and he killed himself the evening before his testimony was due to take place. So the House Select Committee was faced with the problem of dead witnesses. The one other significance of the House Select Committee was the audio evidence that they examined. A Dallas policeman, a motorcycle cop, had left his radio on during the motorcade and recorded the assassination. Acoustics experts were brought in to take a look at this, or to listen to this evidence, and determined that there were more than 3 shots fired, and at least one of these shots came from the infamous grassy knoll, which is to the right and front of the president, not behind him, where the Warren Commission said all the shots came from. So what you have here are 2 different official U.S. government investigations of the Kennedy assassination. The Warren Commission on the one hand, and the House Select Committee on the other. The Warren Commission says Kennedy was killed as a result of one lone gunman and no conspiracy. The House Select Committee says that the president was killed probably as a result of the committee, as a result of a conspiracy, since there were 4 shots fired and they were coming from different directions. So you can sort of pick and choose like a smorgasbord which of these official investigations that you'd like to believe. When we meet next, I want to talk about the final investigation and then an unofficial investigation by a private citizen. So we'll pick that up next time. Thanks.